Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to challenge maybe what you think you know about being professional.
Yeah.
So just, being competent, good at your job.
Mm.
Or is it, well, something a lot more complicated, maybe even exclusionary? We're going to uncover some of the hidden forces behind professional gatekeeping.
That's right. We're diving into this idea called sane-heteroprofessionalism. It sounds like a mouthful, but we'll break it down.
Okay.
We're drawing on a really important academic paper from Davies and her colleagues just out this year. And maybe even more importantly, we've got a perspective from Dr. Jaime Hoerricks.
Right, and she's living inside the very systems we're talking about.
Exactly. So our goal today is really to unpack how these sort of deeply ingrained assumptions about what's normal or default, how they actually shape who gets seen as credible or competent.
And how that plays out in, our workplaces, our institutions, our own experience. So this isn't just theory. We're looking at the hidden gears of power in professional life. And hopefully, you'll leave seeing things a bit differently, maybe in your own career, or even just thinking about a meeting you have next week. It's about that intersection of knowledge and identity.
Okay, so let's start unpacking sane heteroprofessionalism, Davis et al.
Okay.
Talk about it as these two intertwined forces.
Sure.
First, there's sanism, that's discrimination based on mental health or neurotype. Think autism, ADHD, anxiety, things like that.
Okay.
And then there's cis-heteronormativity. Basically, the assumption that being cisgender and heterosexual is the standard, the default way to be.
And these two things work together to police who's seen as professionally acceptable.
Exactly. It regulates who's considered viable.
So it's less about your actual work output and more about how you embody yourself, how you come across.
Yes. The paper argues that professional standards aren't neutral. They're actually a kind of disciplinary system.
Policing how you think, feel, relate to people.
Right. And they call this, and this is really powerful, epistemic violence disguised as competency.
Wow. So invalidating your way of knowing, but framing it as just, you're not skilled enough.
Precisely. And this is where Dr. Hoerricks' experience is just so crucial.
Yeah, tell us about that. She identifies as autistic, a Gestalt language processor.
Right, which means she processes information holistically in patterns, often non-linearly. Also ADHD, so autistic and ADHD trans, and mad.
So she's got multiple perspectives intersecting here.
Absolutely. And she says she's writing from within the very system their analysis dissects. It's not just academic critique for her.
It's lived reality.
Yeah, she calls it an active situated counter-inscription, basically pushing back from the inside, showing how these professional structures function as a machinery of exclusion.
Okay, so professionalism demands a certain kind of performance then, not just doing the job.
That's exactly what Davies are. They call it a disciplinary mechanism, demanding an entire performance of normative embodiment, a kind of governance of self.
Like acting out a role.
Yeah. And Dr. Hoerricks says this is painfully familiar. She gives examples like IEP meetings, job interviews, administrative reviews.
What's expected in those situations?
She says there's this unspoken rule. You have to be calm, contained, emotionally neutral, and cognitively linear.
Linear, right. But her processing isn't linear.
Exactly. Her autistic Gestalt language processing. It's recursive, metaphorical, relational. But she says gatekeepers often misread that as disorganized or emotionally labile.
Even if she's making perfect sense in her own way and has the expertise.
Yes. Which, as you can imagine, creates intense anticipatory anxiety.
I can only imagine.
And she says this anxiety isn't irrational. It's a precise reading of the real risk of being discredited.
She knows the stakes. She also uses this circuit breaker metaphor, right? What's that about?
Yeah, it's fascinating. She describes it as an internal load management system. It helps her stay functional in these environments that aren't set up for her.
A coping mechanism?
A sophisticated one. But again, it often gets misread by others as instability, not as a strength.
It's like the very tools she uses to cope are then used as evidence against her.
That's a good way to put it. But here's where it gets really interesting, almost ironic.
Okay.
Dr. Hoerricks reveals that all this systemic friction, this struggle, has actually given birth to 3 textbooks.
Wow. What are they?
No Place for Autism, Holistic Language Instruction, and Decolonizing Language Education.
And these aren't just sitting on her shelf.
No way.
Yeah.
These books are now being used to inform the very professional training structures that once sought to discipline her.
That's incredible. Where are they being used?
They're published by Lived Places Publishing, which focuses on this kind of scholarship, and they're in libraries at places like Cambridge, Princeton, NYU, Toronto, Georgetown, dozens of top universities.
So the person who faced gatekeeping, because her way of being didn't fit the professional mold, is now literally teaching the next generation of professionals through texts held in these elite institutions.
Exactly. She talks about starting out functionally illiterate and now this. It's quite a journey.
It's a huge testament to her resilience and the value of her perspective.
Absolutely. But she's also clear. The unspoken gatekeeping remains. Even with the books, the degrees, the expertise, the embodied deviation is always read first.
The institutions might buy her books, but accepting her as she is still a challenge for them.
That seems to be the crux of it.
So we've talked about Sanism and Cis-Heteronormativity. How do they intersect in her experience, Davies et al.? Say they're co-constituted, right? Meaning they build on each other.
Yeah, and for Dr. Hoerricks, it's not abstract, it's daily life.
Okay.
Well, she says her transness, for instance, isn't usually questioned directly in terms of competence, but it hovers unspoken as a perceived risk.
Coded language, like worries about fit or team culture.
Exactly, those kinds of vague terms.
Right.
And then her neurodivergence adds another layer, but it's not just like adding two stresses together.
Yeah.
She calls it a recursive theater of dissonance.
Okay, what does that mean?
It's like she's required to perform this very regulated, neutral, professional persona, but the very act being in that system, which isn't built for her, triggers her natural processing, the recursive thoughts, the gestalts, sometimes dysregulation.
So the demand itself creates the friction. What's that like internally? She talks about internal calibration.
Yeah, she describes being in, say, a performance review, and every word, gesture, and inflection is filtered through a hypersensitive predictive model. She's constantly analyzing and adjusting.
That sounds exhausting.
Immensely. And her natural way of making sense of things, her gestalt processing, is illegible in those settings. Her use of metaphor, the density of connections she makes,
Gets read as confusing.
yeah, rendered incomprehensible by systems that equate linearity with truth. And she calls forcing herself not to process that way epistemic violence. It forces her to fragment my own knowing.
That line is incredibly powerful. They want my knowledge as product, not as embodiment.
Isn't it? It cuts right to the heart of it. The system tolerates her expertise, uses her textbooks maybe, but only if it's separated from the person, the way of being that produced it.
She also mentions dual awareness. What's that?
It's like she's navigating the review, feeling the suspicion, but simultaneously she's also an observer, watching the whole dynamic unfold, seeing patterns the gatekeepers themselves don't see.
Like she has a clearer view of the system because she's partially outside its norms.
That's exactly her point. She says, it is not that I misunderstand these systems, it is that I see them too clearly.
Wow.
And then she adds, the rupture they dismiss as my instability is, in fact, their own atmospheric incoherence.
So she's saying the problem isn't her, it's the system's own inconsistencies and dysfunction that she's picking up on.
Precisely. Which leads right into the next point about whose knowledge even gets counted.
Right. Davies et al. Critique these epistemic boundaries. And Dr. Hoerricks have a really concrete example of this, doesn't she?
She does. She talks about trying to find research connecting nocturnal panic attacks and gestalt language processing. Nothing. Zero results.
Not because it's not a real connection for her, or potentially for others.
No. She says it's because of exclusion. The Academy simply has not yet authorized these intersections as legitimate domains of inquiry. It's an evidentiary void.
So if the official channels of knowledge ignore your reality, what do you do?
Well, she describes what she calls a survivalist turn, turning to platforms like Substack, using autoethnography writing about her own experience doing self-published theorizing.
Creating the knowledge base herself.
Exactly. She calls it counter-knowledge production. It's about asserting narrative sovereignty, her right to define her own experience when the dominant systems would erase it. She's not just describing, she's naming the structures that make her invisible.
This links back to the idea of competency, doesn't it? If your experience isn't even seen as valid data, how can you be deemed competent within that framework?
Right. And Davies et al. Frame competency itself as a form of social control.
How does Dr. Hoerricks see that playing out, especially in education?
She argues that often Competency reviews in teaching aren't really measuring teaching as this complex relational thing. They're measuring role compliance.
Role compliance,
Meaning, are you a reliable delivery mechanism for state-sanctioned content and corporate-approved pedagogical scripts? Are you following the program?
So less about connecting with students, more about sticking to the script.
That's the critique. She sees the modern classroom less as purely educational and more as a node within a much larger economic apparatus.
Involving
Corporate curriculum vendors, edtech platforms, data mining assessment companies, the whole industry around education.
And in that context, evaluations become more about checking compliance.
Less quality assurance, more compliance monitoring is how she puts it.
So where does someone like her fit into that? Her autistic way of being, her gestalt processing, her trans identity.
Within that machine, she says, those aren't assets. They are liabilities to be managed.
Why liability?
Because the perceived threat is unpredictability within a tightly regulated delivery system.
They want predictable output.
Yes. She observes that the professional gaze is looking for evidence of my alignment to pre-approved pacing guides, behavioral management protocols, and scripted interventions, often sold by corporate vendors.
This brings us back to that idea of extraction.
Absolutely. This system uses her labor, her textbooks are circulating, her knowledge might be drawn on when it's useful, but it's deeply uncomfortable with her actual embodied presence.
The system wants my output whilst actively marginalizing my being.
It's not a contradiction, she says. It is extraction.
And this dysfunction she feels, it's not just in her head, it's infrastructural.
Yes. She gives the example of working in districts using corporate partnerships, private equity-backed evaluation tools. Her mind, her GLP mind, registers these incongruities viscerally.
Her internal alarm system is going off because the system itself is incoherent.
That's the idea. Her recursive loops, the things seen as instability, are actually high-sensitivity readings of atmospheric incoherence.
And her closing line on this is devastating. The system breathes in dysfunction and calls it policy. I detect the breach and am called unstable.
It really lands, doesn't it?
It does. Now, Davies et al. Also point to professional training programs like teacher education as key places where this filtering happens.
Right, the entry points to the profession. And Dr. Hoerricks has been through multiple graduate programs and credentialing processes.
And what did she encounter there? Was it overt discrimination?
Not usually explicit rejection, she says. It's more often the far more insidious operation of tacit exclusion.
Through those vague terms again.
Exactly. Words like fit, stability, team player. She calls them linguistic smokescreens.
Why is her autistic system not legible there? What's the fundamental clash?
She believes it's because her very presence exposes the epistemic fragility of the system itself. It's not just that she teaches differently.
It's that her existence challenges the underlying assumptions.
Yes, it challenges the assumed default of who education is designed for.
And this directly led to her book, No Place for Autism.
Correct. It came out of all these experiences and spaces that demanded her intellectual work, but denied her ontological legitimacy, her right to be who she is in that space.
So these programs end up filtering out people whose lived experiences could actually challenge and improve the system, especially if those experiences disrupt the reliance on corporate models.
That's the argument. They remain overwhelmingly cis-normative, neurotypical, and effectively narrow, making professional preparation itself an active site of epistemic violence.
There's one more really crucial point in Dr. Hoerricks' reflection, this meta-observation about how her different identities or experiences are treated.
Ah, yes, the siloing effect. She notes the lack of research connecting all the dots: autism, GLP, ADHD, anxiety, panic attacks. The system tends to slice them into silos.
Treating each one as a separate problem to be managed or fixed?
Exactly. Managed, normalized, treated in isolation. But she pushes back hard against that.
How does she see it?
She says, they are not separate. They are aspects of one integrated system. My system, doing its work to navigate an environment that remains structurally misaligned.
It's just her, being her, in a world not built for her.
This is simply my reality, she says. Her system is doing its best to stay functional in a world that was not only never built with people like me in mind, but actively designed to work against us.
Which brings us back to who gets to define normal.
Precisely. She argues the global north has built entire professional, educational, and clinical infrastructures that privilege a very narrow version of embodiment, cognition, and emotional expression, and then label everything outside of that as disordered.
So the problem isn't her way of being.
The problem is who gets to decide what counts as normal?
And from her integrated perspective, things like panic attacks or her language processing aren't disorders in a vacuum.
No, the panic attacks are my body's alarm system responding to a genuinely threatening environment. The Gestalt processing is how I assemble coherence. It is my intelligence doing its work.
So the lack of research isn't just an oversight, it's part of the exclusion.
Yes. And her writing, her counter-knowledge production, becomes a counter-archive.
Staking a claim.
Simply stating, we exist. This way of being exists. These ways of knowing are real.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this up, this deep dive into sane heteroprofessionalism using both the theory from Davies et al. And Dr. Hoerricks' an incredibly powerful lived experience.
Yeah.
It really does validate experiences that many people might feel but not have the words for.
Absolutely. It gives a name to these invisible forces. And it also shows where the academic work can keep growing, right? By really integrating these embodied ways of knowing and surviving the GLP, the threat loops, the specific viewpoint of trans neurodivergent educators.
Yeah, feels like we need much more of this lived experience scholarship, as you called it. Work led by neurodivergent people, trans people, mad people.
Work that pushes back against just being put in diagnostic boxes and instead actively builds those missing archives. Because that evidentiary void wasn't an accident.
No, it was curated through decades of epistemic exclusion.
Exactly.
So maybe the final thought for you, listening, is about our own role as learners, as thinkers. Our work is maybe to help make that absence visible, to challenge it, to refuse the kind of silencing that professionalism can demand.
Yeah, like Dr. Hoerricks says, we are not waiting for permission to exist. We are already here.
A powerful place to end. So maybe reflect on that. How do these ideas challenge your ideas of competence, of professionalism? Think about those times you felt you had to perform or hide a part of yourself at work or in another professional setting. What was really going on there?